I still remember the moment they handed me the security badge, the one that granted access to a section of the Vatican no one outside a handful of trusted clerics had ever seen. It felt unreal, like I'd crossed a threshold into a world where time itself was tangled in shadows and secrets. The morning was cold and gray, a thin drizzle blurring the edges of the city outside. Rome carried on unaware, as if the ancient stones beneath my feet and the hidden relics deep below were just forgotten whispers. The heavy iron doors groaned open before me, revealing a tunnel carved from centuries of stone and silence. The air inside was instantly different, thicker, colder, dry with a musty scent that clung to my clothes and skin. It was the kind of smell you only find where time has stopped, where dust and decay and old prayers have settled like a layer of ash. I stepped inside, feeling the weight of history pressing down like an unseen hand. My footsteps echoed off the vaulted ceilings as I moved deeper into the labyrinthine corridors. Shelves lined with relics of impossible age and dubious provenance stretched before me. Cracked chalices stained black, tattered robes whose threads whispered of forgotten masses, ancient crosses wrought with strange symbols. Each item seemed to hum faintly with a presence I couldn't explain, as if they were more than objects. They were memories, warnings, maybe curses. I pulled out my leather-bound notebook, the pages blank but ready, and flipped on my flashlight. Its beam cut a narrow path through the shadows, revealing glimpses of cryptic inscriptions and fragile bones locked behind glass. The silence was oppressive, thick enough to suffocate. I swallowed hard, trying to focus on my task, catalog, describe, and document. But already a cold shiver traced my spine. There was something off here, something beneath the surface of the cold stone, and whispered prayers. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to cling just a moment too long, or the subtle shifting of shapes in my peripheral vision. I shook my head, forcing reason to take hold. I was an archivist, a scholar, a rational mind among relics and myths. But deep inside, a small voice trembled, warning me that this vault held secrets darker than history dared to tell. I traced my fingers along a tarnished cross, feeling the chill of metal and the faint vibration, as if it pulsed with a heartbeat all its own. The silence stretched out endlessly, broken only by the soft scrape of my pen on paper and the distant drip of water somewhere far beyond sight. I told myself it was just the vault settling, that the stories were only stories. But as I took a breath, I realized the shadows were watching, waiting, and I had just begun to step inside a world that might never let me leave the same. The deeper I moved into the vault, the heavier the silence became. No, not just silence, but something alive, thick with anticipation. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but it felt feeble against the shadows that clung to the stone like a living skin. I was cataloging a set of ancient manuscripts when I first sensed it. A subtle movement in the periphery, something so faint I almost convinced myself it was my imagination. A flicker, like a shadow folding in on itself, too quick to catch but undeniable. My breath hitched. The air grew colder, sharper. I rubbed my arms, trying to dismiss the sensation, but a prickling at the back of my neck made my skin crawl. I glanced around, heart thudding, but the vault stretched away in all directions, empty and still, or so I thought. The footsteps I heard next weren't mine. I was certain of it. A soft, dragging shuffle echoed faintly down the corridor behind me. I froze, gripping my notebook tightly as every rational thought fled. My mind searched for a logical explanation. Another archivist, security, but I was alone. I had checked. No one was supposed to be here. My flashlight flickered. In that brief blackout, the darkness seemed to pulse, and when the light returned, something caught my eye, a pale shape just beyond the shelf. I swung the beam sharply, but nothing was there, only the cold stone walls, the relics, and the oppressive shadows. I swallowed hard and pressed forward, telling myself to stay calm. But the vault had changed. The walls seemed closer, the shadows deeper, as if the very air was tightening around me. I could hear a faint scratching noise, like nails dragging on stone, coming from the direction of an iron cage holding a sealed box bound in chains and etched with indecipherable symbols. Curiosity warred with fear. I approached slowly, heart pounding. As I drew near, the temperature dropped even more, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. I reached out a trembling hand to touch the box's cold surface, and the moment my fingers brushed the metal, a sudden wave of vertigo crashed over me. The room spun, the shadows stretched, and a whisper, a sound too soft to catch fully, brushed my ear like a sigh from the past. I staggered back, blinking against a sudden haze that clouded my vision. The whispering grew, almost inaudible but relentless, a murmuring chant beneath the dripping silence. I wanted to run, to flee the vault and never look back. But my legs felt rooted, trapped in the heavy air. I forced myself to take a steadying breath and pressed my palm against the wall, leaning on the cold stone. What had I just awakened? What secrets had stirred in the dark, and was it still watching me? I leaned against the stone wall, trying to catch my breath, but the heaviness in my chest refused to lift. The shadows around me seemed to pulse with a life of their own, lingering in the corners of my vision. I told myself it was exhaustion or a trick of the light, yet deep inside, a gnawing certainty grew that something had been disturbed, something that should have remained untouched. For a long moment I simply stood there, the cold stone biting into my skin through my jacket, grounding me. But the silence that returned was different, thicker, expectant, as if the vault itself was holding its breath. The whispers faded, but the feeling of unseen eyes remained, tracking my every move. I closed my eyes, willing myself to rationalize it all. Shadows shifting with the flicker of the flashlight, the breeze of stale air through ancient cracks, my mind playing tricks on a tired body. Yet even as I tried to convince myself, a part of me refused to be calmed. I could still feel the weight of those whispered voices pressing against my ears, the brush of cold air like ghostly fingers trailing down my neck. My hands trembled as I clutched my notebook, now soaked with sweat. How could I write when every word felt inadequate to capture the dread creeping inside me? I wandered back slowly, retracing my steps with deliberate care, hoping that the familiarity of the vault's layout would anchor me. But even familiar relics now seemed sinister. Stained chalices gleamed like eyes watching, rusted keys whispered secrets I dared not hear, and the cracked rosaries felt like chains tightening around my spirit. I felt a growing distance from the rational world I knew. The vault was no longer just a place of history and faith, but a labyrinth of unspoken horrors. A quiet despair settled over me. How many had come before and been broken by this place? How many stories had been buried beneath centuries of dust, untold and erased? I realized that my job was no longer just to catalog objects. It was to bear witness to a darkness that transcended time and reason. My fingers trembled as I scribbled a note. Unease growing. Voices, shadows, need to report. But even the act of writing felt futile. Who would believe me? Who could understand the invisible weight pressing on my soul? The air grew colder still, and I hugged myself, struggling to keep panic at bay. The vault had secrets, terrible and watching, and I was no longer a distant observer. I was part of its story now, marked by the relics and the silence between them. I forced myself to take a deep breath and press on. Whatever waited in these shadows, whatever truths the Vatican tried to erase, these secrets were still alive, and they were still watching. The vault's oppressive silence welcomed me back like an old wound, raw and unhealed. The morning air outside was sharp and cool, the kind that seeps through even the thickest cloak. A thin mist hung low over the Vatican's courtyards, blurring the sharp outlines of statues and ancient trees. As I approached the heavy iron door that guarded the vault's entrance, my breath caught in my throat, not from the cold, but from the weight of the unknown waiting behind it. Crossing the threshold again, the familiar scent of damp stone and aged parchment embraced me, but beneath it lurked something new, a faint trace of burnt incense mixed with something acrid, metallic, like rust and old blood. The light from my flashlight cut jagged paths through the darkness, revealing endless rows of relics, each one steeped in silence and shadows. Yet this time the silence felt different, not empty but filled with a low, unspoken tension. As I moved deeper, the vault seemed to pulse beneath my feet, like a living thing breathing slow and heavy. The air grew colder still, every breath leaving a thin mist in front of me. A whisper rose from the shadows, so faint I almost missed it. It was not a voice but a susurrus, like dry leaves rustling or distant prayers half forgotten. I paused, straining to listen, but the words twisted away before I could grasp their meaning. The stone walls closed in, the darkness pooling thicker between the relics. I found myself drawn to a section of iron cages I hadn't dared to explore the day before. Each cage held relics chained and locked away, objects too dangerous or cursed to be touched freely. The atmosphere thickened, a heavy stillness settling over the row like a storm about to break. The whispering grew louder, a tangled chorus of voices overlapping in a way that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. My flashlight flickered, and for a breath, I thought I saw something. A pale figure standing just beyond the edge of the beam, its outline hazy and shifting like smoke. I blinked, heart hammering, but it vanished like a wisp on the wind. The silence slammed back in, suffocating and complete. I forced my breath steady, focusing on the relics themselves. Cracked reliquaries, faded vestments frayed with age, crosses etched with cryptic symbols. I traced my gloved fingers over the worn inscriptions, prayers, curses, and warnings carved centuries ago to hold back dark forces. And I understood, with a chill that reached deeper than the cold air, that these relics were not just remnants of faith or superstition. They were guardians of secrets that still whispered and watched. The vault was no longer just a place of dust and memory. It had become a threshold to something darker, a realm where shadows spoke and the past refused to stay buried. And I was listening. The whispers grew louder as I lingered near the iron cages, their indistinct murmurs crawling under my skin like cold fingers. At first, I thought it was my mind fracturing, stress and exhaustion weaving illusions in the stale air. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be a trick. It was a chant, or maybe a prayer twisted by time and fear. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus on the work, to catalog the relics without succumbing to the growing unease. As I reached for a particularly worn box sealed with iron clasps, the air shifted again, colder now, sharper, as if the vault itself inhaled and held its breath. The beam of my flashlight wavered, flickering like a candle flame caught in a draft. I cursed under my breath and steadied the light, but my hands were shaking, betraying the calm I tried to maintain. Suddenly, I heard it. A soft scraping noise from deeper within the vault, not mechanical or accidental, but deliberate, a slow, dragging sound like nails against stone. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat thudding loudly in the oppressive silence. I turned slowly toward the source, the light trembling in my grasp, revealing nothing but more shadows and ancient relics. The whispering surged again, overlapping voices overlapping into a cacophony of unintelligible words, and for a moment I felt utterly surrounded. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows thickening and twisting. A pale figure flickered at the edge of my vision, gone the instant I blinked. I spun on my heel, flashlight darting wildly, but I was alone, or at least no one I could see. I tried to steady my breathing, reciting prayers in my mind, clinging to logic and reason. Maybe this place was old, its silence a heavy weight that played tricks on the senses. Yet I couldn't shake the certainty that I had crossed an invisible boundary, a line between the known and the unknowable. Then the box in front of me shifted, a mere fraction, but enough to freeze me in place. The chains rattled softly and a cold, sour scent like rotted wood filled the air. My skin prickled with raw, unexplainable fear. I wanted to step back, to flee the vault forever, but my body was numb, locked in place by the weight of something unseen. The whispers settled into a low, sinister hum, as if the relics themselves were awakening, watching me with ancient, unblinking eyes. I swallowed my panic and forced my fingers to scribble in my notebook, desperate to ground myself in the tangible. But the words blurred as my mind raced with questions I dared not ask aloud. What was I dealing with? What secrets did these relics guard? And most terrifying of all, was I already part of the vault's dark story? The moments after the shifting box and the chorus of whispers felt suspended in time, as though the vault itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to break the silence. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall, my heart still pounding fiercely in my chest, every nerve alive with raw, unfiltered fear. The chill in the air was no longer just physical, it seeped into my bones, a creeping frost that no amount of clothing could stave off. I tried to steady my trembling hands and slow my ragged breathing, but the image of that fleeting pale figure haunted my vision. It wasn't a trick of the light or a stray shadow. It had a shape, a form that defied explanation. It felt both distant and uncomfortably close, like a warning carved from some forgotten nightmare. I wiped sweat from my brow, even though the air was bitterly cold. The silence that returned was suffocating. Not the peaceful quiet I'd hoped for, but a suffocating void that pressed in on me from all sides. It was as if the vault resented my presence, resented that I had disturbed its fragile equilibrium. A deep, gnawing dread settled in my stomach, one that no rational thought could chase away. I found myself questioning everything, my training, my faith, my very sanity. Was this real? Had I imagined the whispers, the figure, the shifting chains? The logical part of my mind clung to explanations. Exhaustion, stress, the oppressive atmosphere twisting my senses, but deep down, I knew this was something else, something older and darker than any history book dared to record. I sat down on the cold floor, clutching my notebook like a lifeline. The words I tried to write felt hollow, inadequate to capture the weight of what I'd experienced. How could I document something that defied explanation? How could I face the world outside this vault when the shadows here seemed to reach inside me? Memories flickered unbidden. Stories I'd heard whispered about cursed relics, vanished archivists, and secrets buried beneath the Vatican's sacred veneer. Were those warnings real? Was I now another chapter in that hidden history? The thought was almost too much to bear. But even as fear threatened to consume me, a stubborn part of me refused to look away. I had been chosen, or perhaps condemned, to witness these things, to carry their stories forward. The vault's darkness was not just an absence of light, but a presence, a sentient weight that watched and waited. I forced myself to rise, each movement heavy with exhaustion and dread. The relics around me gleamed silently, their secrets locked away in shadow and silence. And though I wanted nothing more than to flee, I knew I could not turn back. The whispering shadows had claimed a part of me now, and their story was far from over. The next time I entered the vault, a heavy sense of anticipation clung to me like a second skin. The memories of whispered voices and shadowed figures from the previous visit still haunted my mind, but I forced myself to push deeper. My task was clear: catalog the relics, no matter how unsettling. I told myself that this was a place of history and faith, not a theater for my fears. The air was colder than before, biting through my jacket and settling deep in my bones. The faint smell of incense lingered faintly, mixed now with a sharper tang, something like iron and old smoke. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was unfamiliar enough to set my nerves on edge. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom, and stepped carefully over uneven stone. Today, I had a destination in mind: the Forbidden Reliquary. It was a small iron-bound box, rumored to be sealed for centuries, hidden in a remote corner of the vault. The records I'd been given were sparse and cryptic, hinting at its dark history but never fully explaining why it was locked away. Something about the weight of those missing details unsettled me more than any whisper or shadow. I found the reliquary at the end of a narrow aisle, nestled between shelves heavy with dusty tomes and rusted artifacts. The iron bands that bound it were old, pitted, and etched with strange symbols that twisted and curled like ancient vines. Thick chains wrapped around the box, locked tight with a massive padlock that looked as old as the Vatican itself. As I knelt to inspect it, the temperature dropped sharply, so suddenly that my breath came out in a misty cloud. The silence deepened, heavy and absolute, broken only by the faint scraping of my gloves against the cold metal. I ran my fingers lightly over the symbols, tracing their worn curves. They didn't resemble any script I knew. They were a language of shadows and fear. I hesitated, aware of the weight in the air, like the reliquary was watching me back, waiting for something. A sudden shiver ran through me, not entirely caused by the cold. I took a step back, heart racing, and forced myself to focus on my notebook. Descriptions, measurements, inscriptions, details that could be recorded and analyzed later. But even as I wrote, the unease didn't fade. The vault seemed to pulse around me, the walls closing in slightly, and the shadows deepened to ink black. I felt eyes, unseen and unblinking, fixed on me from beyond the veil of darkness. For the first time, I understood that some relics were not just items of faith or history. They were vessels of something ancient, something alive. I closed the notebook and stood slowly, the chill settling into my bones. The Forbidden Reliquary was more than a box. It was a threshold, a barrier holding back secrets that had been buried in silence for centuries. And by cataloging it, I was stepping closer to the edge of something that might never let me go. As I lingered near the Forbidden Reliquary, the air thickened, becoming almost viscous with tension. My flashlight's beam wavered as if caught in a breeze I couldn't feel. The silence cracked. The faintest whisper brushed past my ear, like a breath stolen from another time. I spun around, heart hammering, but found only the cold stone walls staring back. The chains around the box rattled softly, an eerie sound that seemed to echo too loudly in the vastness of the vault. My pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed to back away, but an inexplicable force rooted me in place. I felt eyes, countless, unblinking, gazing at me from the darkness beyond the beam. A sudden gust of cold wind swept through the aisle, carrying with it the acrid scent of burnt flesh and old incense. It whispered a language I couldn't understand, a chorus of sorrow and rage that gnawed at my mind. The reliquary seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own, the iron bands tightening as if alive. I reached out, compelled by a mixture of dread and curiosity. My fingers brushed the cold metal, and the world seemed to tilt. A low hum filled the vault, growing louder and more insistent, vibrating through my bones. The shadows stretched and flickered, dancing in the corners of my vision. Suddenly, a pale hand, a flicker of something human but distorted, slid from behind the reliquary. It was translucent, shimmering with an otherworldly glow. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. Darkness swallowed the beam instantly. Panic surged. The whispers became Anam's agonized, pleading, accusing. I fumbled for the flashlight, hands shaking violently, and clicked it back on. The vault was empty. The hand was gone, but the oppressive presence lingered, wrapping around me like a suffocating cloak. I forced myself to steady my breath, counting each inhale and exhale. The voices faded to murmurs, then silence. But the memory of those eyes, the spectral hand, and the pulse of the reliquary stayed etched deep in my mind. I scribbled frantically in my notebook, trying to capture the impossible, the inexplicable. Rational explanations slipped away. Noises, fatigue, tricks of light, none could explain what I had just seen or felt. The vault had revealed a fragment of its dark heart, and I was left trembling in its shadow. As I backed away from the reliquary, a chilling thought took hold. Some relics were more than history, they were prisons, and by touching them, I might have opened a door I could never close. I sank to the cold stone floor, the weight of what I had just experienced pressing down on me like a physical force. My hands trembled uncontrollably, clutching my notebook as if it were the last tether to reality. The vault around me seemed to pulse with silence, an oppressive quiet that magnified every breath I took and every heartbeat echoing in my ears. I was alone, yet the sense of presence lingered, an invisible shadow clinging to my skin and whispering dark secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. The image of that pale, distorted hand haunted my thoughts relentlessly. It wasn't just a trick of the light or a fragment of imagination born from exhaustion. No, it was real. Too vivid to deny, too chilling to forget. The spectral glow, the way it emerged from the reliquary like a shadow breaking free from its cage, filled me with a dread that twisted deep inside my chest. What had I unleashed? My mind raced to piece together what I had just witnessed. The reliquary wasn't merely an ancient box. It was a prison, an anchor for something terrible, something that should have remained buried in darkness. The chains and symbols weren't mere decoration, they were bindings designed to hold back whatever dwelled within, and by touching it I had disturbed a fragile balance. I forced myself to take slow, steady breaths, repeating prayers I barely believed anymore. Rational thoughts clashed with raw fear. Was this the weight of faith being tested or the edge of madness creeping closer? The vault had become a place where the past's shadows bled into the present, where relics weren't silent witnesses, but active participants in a story far darker than any history book dared tell. Sitting there in the cold, I realized how small and vulnerable I was in the face of such ancient power. The stories I'd heard whispered in hushed tones suddenly felt real. The vanished archivists, the unexplained disappearances, the inexplicable voices. Perhaps they weren't legends but warnings, echoes of those who had come before and never returned the same. Yet, despite the fear, a stubborn part of me refused to look away. I was bound to this place now, marked by the vault's secrets and its silence. The forbidden reliquary had opened a door, and even if I wanted to turn back, the path was lost behind me. I closed my notebook with a shaky hand and stood, my legs unsteady but determined. The vault watched silently as I left that day, the weight of its mysteries settling heavier on my shoulders. I knew the road ahead was uncertain and perilous, but one thing was clear. The secrets the Vatican tried to erase were not gone. They were alive, watching, and waiting. Returning to the vault felt heavier this time, as if the very air inside pressed down on me with a silent judgment. The Vatican's ancient stones, polished by centuries of footsteps and whispered prayers, seemed colder, more distant. Outside, the sky was overcast, a thick gray blanket muffling the world beyond these sacred walls. The courtyard's usual hum of birds and tourists was replaced by a haunting stillness that seeped into my bones as I crossed the threshold once again. The heavy iron door groaned open, revealing the familiar labyrinth of shadowed corridors and towering shelves crammed with relics. But today the vault felt less like a repository of history and more like a tomb, an eerie sanctuary where silence reigned supreme. The faint scent of dust mingled with something sharper, metallic, as if the relics themselves breathed a cold, forgotten breath. I flicked on my flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness but never quite penetrating the oppressive gloom. Each step echoed off the stone walls, the sound swallowed quickly by the heavy silence. My heartbeat thudded loudly in my ears, a reminder that I was alive in a place that felt strangely detached from life. Today, my focus was a section deeper in the vault I hadn't yet dared to explore, a secluded alcove rumored to house relics so ancient and forbidden that even the Vatican's highest authorities rarely acknowledged their existence. The records were vague, coded, hinting at artifacts that had been locked away not for preservation but for containment. As I navigated the twisting aisles, the shadows seemed to shift and stretch, blurring the edges of my vision. The air grew colder still, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. I paused, turning slowly, but the darkness held its secrets close. A shiver ran down my spine, not entirely from the chill. Ahead, the alcove revealed itself, a small, windowless chamber lined with iron cages and sealed glass cases. The relics inside were strange and unsettling, bones cracked with age, faded manuscripts scrawled with indecipherable symbols, objects that looked both sacred and profane. The silence here was thick enough to suffocate, broken only by the occasional creak of metal or soft scrape of stone. I steadied my breathing and reached for my notebook. The task was clear: document everything, no matter how disturbing. But even as I wrote, the vault whispered around me, the lingering echo of prayers and curses, promises and threats, all tangled in the shadows. It was a place where faith and fear collided, and I was caught in the middle. I realized then that the vault wasn't just a physical space. It was a threshold, a boundary between the seen and unseen, the known and the forbidden. And as I stood there, surrounded by relics that bore silent witness to centuries of secrets, I understood that I was venturing deeper into a world that might never let me return unchanged. The deeper I stepped into the alcove, the heavier the silence became, as if the air itself was thickening, resisting my presence. The faint whispers I had sensed earlier grew louder, morphing into an unintelligible chorus that surrounded me like a gathering storm. I paused, gripping my flashlight tightly, its beam flickering slightly as if struggling against some unseen force. Then, without warning, a sharp metallic clang echoed through the chamber, a sound so out of place that it made me jump. My heart pounded fiercely in my chest, each beat pounding like a warning drum. The source of the noise was a heavy iron cage nearby, its door slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed it before. The lock was broken, hanging limply from one hinge. The relic inside was obscured by shadows, but the cold air radiating from it was palpable, like the breath of something long dead. A sudden chill swept through the alcove, and I felt a presence, a weight pressing down on me, invisible but undeniable. The whispers escalated into urgent murmurs, curling around my ears like smoke. I tried to steady my nerves, reminding myself that I was a professional, trained to face the unknown with reason and composure. But the shadows seemed too close in, the darkness pulsing as if alive. Suddenly, the beam of my flashlight caught movement, a flicker at the edge of my vision. I swung the light toward it, and for a brief moment I saw a figure, a silhouette draped in tattered robes, face obscured by a deep hood. It vanished almost instantly, leaving only a faint echo of coldness behind. Panic clawed at my throat, but I forced myself to stay still, listening to the relentless whispers that now filled the air. They weren't words, but a sound, a wave of sorrow and warning that seemed to emanate from the relic itself. My skin prickled with dread as I realized that whatever was trapped in that broken cage was trying to communicate, reaching out through the veil of silence. I reached for my notebook, hands trembling, and began to write in desperate haste. The air around me grew colder still, and my breath came out in icy puffs. The feeling of being watched intensified, and every shadow seemed to twist and writhe with hidden life. Then, without any warning, the door to the alcove slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. My heart leapt into my throat. I spun around, flashlight darting wildly, but the room was empty, except for the relics and shadows that now seemed alive with menace. I was trapped, alone with the vault's restless spirits and secrets. The whispers swelled, wrapping around me like chains, and I knew that the silent sanctuary had claimed me for a moment I would never forget. The sudden slam of the door echoed in my chest long after the sound faded, leaving me trembling and alone in the cold silence of the alcove. My breath hitched as panic surged through my veins like electricity, my skin prickling with a chill that no amount of layering could shake. The shadows seemed to pulse around me, alive and watchful, their presence pressing heavy on my mind and body. I pressed my back against the iron bars of the nearest cage, heart hammering against my ribs as I struggled to steady my shaking hands. The relics that had once been mere objects of history now felt like sentinels, guardians of something ancient and unforgiving. The broken lock, the whispers, the fleeting figure. I couldn't dismiss any of it as coincidence or trickery anymore. Something was here, something watching, waiting. I forced myself to breathe deeply, counting in slow, deliberate beats, trying to quiet the storm inside my head. But the weight of the experience clung to me, dragging at my thoughts and threatening to unravel my grip on reality. I found myself questioning everything, my senses, my sanity, even the foundations of my faith. Was I descending into madness, or was this the vault's dark secret revealing itself, one fragment at a time? The whispers still lingered at the edge of hearing, now softer but no less insistent. They twisted through my mind, fragments of lost prayers, curses, and forgotten names tangled in a web of silence. I tried to capture the moment in my notebook, but the words felt inadequate, too fragile to contain the raw dread and awe coursing through me. Sitting on the cold floor, I wrapped my arms around my knees, a hollow ache settling deep within my chest. The vault's silence was no longer peaceful. It was a living presence, patient and relentless. I was a trespasser in a realm where time twisted and shadows breathed, a witness to truths the world was never meant to see. Yet despite the fear, a reluctant part of me felt drawn deeper. The vault's mysteries called to me, whispered promises of knowledge and revelation, even as they threatened to consume my very soul. I understood now that my role was no longer just to catalog relics, but to bear their stories, the silent, forbidden histories the Vatican tried to erase. With a trembling hand, I closed my notebook and rose unsteadily to my feet. The chill in the air pressed in on me, but so did a fierce determination. The silent sanctuary had shown me a glimpse of its dark heart, and though the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with dread, I knew I could not turn away. The vault's secrets were alive, watching, and so was I. The basilica's grandeur always masked the hidden shadows beneath its stones, but today, as I descended into the catacombs below, the weight of centuries pressed down on me like a physical force. The sunlight above faded quickly, swallowed by narrow tunnels carved from ancient rock, damp and heavy with the scent of earth and forgotten history. The cool air clung to my skin, a sharp contrast to the warmth left behind above ground, and every step echoed softly against the stone walls, carrying whispers I couldn't quite place. I checked my equipment, the flashlight, recorder, and notebook, all ready, yet none seemed sufficient to face the uneasy silence that wrapped around me like a shroud. The flickering beam of the light danced over crumbling bones stacked neatly in ossuaries, tarnished religious artifacts, and faded frescoes that told stories of faith and despair. It was a realm suspended in time, a silent cathedral of memory and secrets where the past lingered in every shadow. The catacombs were off limits to all but a few trusted individuals, and my access was a privilege weighed down by warnings and whispered cautions. The Vatican's official record spoke little of what lay beneath the basilica, and the relics hidden there were among the most enigmatic, objects rumored to be touched by dark rites, artifacts steeped in both reverence and fear. As I moved deeper, the air grew colder, and the silence more oppressive. The faintest sound, my footsteps, a distant drip of water, was swallowed immediately, leaving only the cold presence of the unknown. I felt eyes on me, not human eyes, but something older, watching from the darkness beyond the reach of the light. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a small chamber, its walls lined with relics encased in glass. Among them was an ancient manuscript, its pages brittle and stained, bound with a lock whose key had long been lost. Nearby, a cracked chalice glimmered faintly, etched with symbols that made my skin crawl. I knelt to examine them, fingers tracing the worn edges, feeling a sudden rush of unease, as though the relics themselves were alive, charged with secrets eager to slip free. My heart quickened, the oppressive silence pressing in tighter. The catacombs were no longer just a resting place for the dead. They were a sanctuary for shadows, echoes of ancient power and forbidden knowledge. And I was trespassing deeper into a world where faith and fear were entwined in a fragile, dangerous dance. I steadied my breath, forcing my thoughts to focus on the task ahead. Document everything, no matter how unsettling. But as the chill seeped deeper into my bones, I couldn't shake the feeling that the echoes beneath the basilica were watching me back, waiting for a moment to claim me as part of their story. The deeper I ventured into the catacombs beneath the basilica, the heavier the air became, thick with an ancient weight that settled over me like a shroud. The narrow tunnels seemed to close in, the flickering beam of my flashlight barely penetrating the dense darkness. Every step echoed hollowly, swallowed by the oppressive silence that wrapped around me. It was as if the stones themselves held their breath, watching, waiting. A faint sound, soft and irregular, caught my attention. At first I thought it was the steady drip of water falling from the ceiling, but the rhythm was off, uneven and deliberate. I froze, heart pounding as I strained to listen. The sound grew louder, a faint scraping that echoed off the stone walls, a slow, deliberate noise that sent a shiver crawling up my spine. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I moved cautiously toward the source. Shadows seemed to twist and stretch at the edges of my vision, shapes flickering just beyond the light's reach. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to push forward despite the rising dread knotting my stomach. Then, from the corner of the chamber, a flicker of movement caught my eye. A pale figure, draped in tattered robes, gliding silently through the shadows. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but the coldness radiating from it was unmistakable. The figure paused, turning slowly to face me, and for a moment, our eyes met. The gaze was empty, void of life, yet filled with an ancient sorrow that gnawed at my soul. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. Darkness swallowed the beam instantly. Panic surged, raw and primal. I fumbled in the darkness, hands shaking violently as I struggled to find the light. When I finally clicked it back on, the figure was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, broken only by my ragged breathing. But the oppressive feeling lingered, a heavy presence that pressed down on me from all sides. The relics around the chamber seemed to hum with unseen energy, the ancient symbols etched into their surfaces, pulsing faintly under the beam of my flashlight. I forced myself to kneel and scribble in my notebook, desperate to ground myself in something tangible. But the words blurred before my eyes, my mind reeling with questions I dared not voice. What had I seen? Was it a ghost, a manifestation of the vault's dark past, or something far older and more sinister? As I gathered my courage to leave, a cold whisper brushed past my ear, soft, unintelligible, but filled with warning. The echoes beneath the basilica were no longer silent. They were alive, and they had noticed me. The moment the pale figure vanished, the silence that returned was far heavier than before, thick with unspoken threats and a presence I could neither see nor escape. My breathing was ragged, shallow, and every nerve in my body screamed in protest. The catacombs no longer felt like a sacred resting place. They had transformed into a trap, a realm where the dead's whispers reached out with cold fingers, pulling at the edges of my sanity. I sank slowly to the cold stone floor, clutching my notebook like a talisman against the encroaching darkness. My hands trembled uncontrollably, betraying the calm I was desperately trying to maintain. The faint glow of the flashlight illuminated faded symbols etched into the walls, ancient marks that now seemed charged with meaning, warnings carved into stone by hands long gone. I wondered if those marks were meant to keep something in, or to warn the living to stay away. The oppressive silence pressed against me, filled with 1,000 silent voices that seemed to pulse beneath the surface. I could almost hear the faintest echoes of prayers, curses, and lost souls trapped between the cracks of time. The weight of centuries crushed down, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. I questioned everything, my purpose, my beliefs, and the fragile line between reality and nightmare. The chilling sensation that I was being watched refused to fade. The shadows that surrounded me no longer felt empty but alive, as if unseen eyes tracked every movement, every breath. A cold sweat slicked my skin despite the chill, and I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, yet I remained rooted, caught in the vault's merciless grip. I forced myself to write, hoping that putting these horrors on paper would ground me, but the words were clumsy, inadequate to capture the raw terror and disbelief clawing at my mind. The vault wasn't just a repository of relics, it was, as a living entity, a threshold where faith and fear collided and merged into something incomprehensible. As I sat there, surrounded by ancient bones and forgotten secrets, I realized that I was no longer a mere observer. I had become part of this dark tapestry, woven into the very fabric of the vault's whispered nightmares. The echoes beneath the basilica had marked me, and there was no turning back. Slowly, I rose to my feet, the chill settling deep into my bones. The path ahead was uncertain, shadowed by dread and mystery. But even as fear gnawed at me, a stubborn resolve flickered within. The vault's secrets were alive, watching, and I was determined to uncover their truth, no matter the cost. The sealed chamber was unlike any other place I had encountered in the vault so far. A small, windowless room buried deep beneath the Vatican, hidden behind layers of stone and iron. The very existence of this chamber was whispered about in hushed tones among the few who knew of it, a place where the most forbidden relics were kept, locked away from eyes that were not meant to see. As I approached the heavy iron-bound door, the air grew colder, thick with a silence that felt almost unnatural. The carved symbols etched into the door's surface were unlike any script I had seen, twisting, jagged lines that seemed to writhe beneath the dim light of my flashlight. My fingers brushed over the cold metal and a shiver ran down my spine. The lock was ancient, but it resisted every attempt to open it, as if the chamber itself was alive and unwilling to yield its secrets. I found a small keyhole concealed beneath a rusted iron plate, and with trembling hands I inserted the fragile key I had discovered in the archives. The lock clicked open with a hollow sound that echoed through the narrow hallway, and the door groaned as it slowly swung inward. The smell that escaped was thick and musty, tinged with something metallic and faintly sweet, like blood and decay. Among the relics, one object drew my attention. A small, obsidian box, unmarked but ominous. It rested on a pedestal at the chamber's center, surrounded by a circle of faded runes painted onto the floor. I could feel the weight of its presence like a heartbeat pulsing in the silence. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat as I stared at it, sensing that this box was unlike anything else I had seen. Despite the unease curling in my stomach, I knew my job was to document these relics, to bear witness to what the Vatican sought to hide. The sealed chamber was the culmination of years of whispered rumors and cryptic hints, and now I stood at its threshold, caught between the known and the unknowable. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows that seemed to shift and breathe around me, and the silence pressed in closer. I was alone here, with only the relics and my racing thoughts. The vault had taken on a new dimension, one where fear and fascination intertwined, and every secret carried a price. The moment I set eyes on the obsidian box resting on the pedestal, a chill ran through me, deeper than the cold that had settled in the vault. It was an object that seemed to absorb the flickering candlelight, swallowing it whole and radiating a darkness that felt almost alive. My fingers itched with an inexplicable urge to reach out to touch it, but a whisper of caution held me back, a silent warning that screamed louder than any voice. I circled the box slowly, flashlight beam trembling as it danced across the room's cracked stone walls. The faded runes etched into the floor beneath the pedestal seemed to pulse faintly, their lines glowing with an eerie, almost imperceptible light. The air thickened, growing heavier with each breath I took, like the weight of centuries pressing down on me. Then a low hum filled the chamber, a vibration that seemed to resonate from the shores. The box itself, spreading through the stone floor and into my bones. The sound was subtle at first, almost too soft to notice, but it grew steadily, filling the room with a deep, resonant tone that seemed to echo through the very fabric of the vault. My heart hammered wildly, every instinct screaming at me to flee, but I was rooted to the spot, caught in a web of fascination and fear. The flame of the candle flickered violently, casting long, wavering shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. I felt a presence, something ancient and powerful, watching me from beyond the veil of reality. Suddenly, the obsidian box shifted, sliding just slightly on the pedestal as if nudged by an unseen hand. The runes on the floor flared brighter, bathing the chamber in a ghostly light. A cold wind swept through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of incense and decay. My breath came out in ragged puffs, mingling with the growing chill that seemed to seep into my very soul. Then the whispers began, a chorus of voices, layered and overlapping, filled with sorrow, anger, and desperate warning. They rose in a crescendo that threatened to overwhelm me, swirling around my head like a storm of broken prayers. I clutched my ears, trying to block the noise, but the voices pierced straight through, embedding themselves deep in my mind. I stumbled back, crashing against a stone shelf as the room spun. The obsidian box now lay open, its contents hidden in shadow, but the darkness within seemed to pulse with life. I couldn't see what was inside, only feel the weight of its malevolence pressing against me. Fear overwhelmed me, raw and primal. I grabbed my notebook, hands shaking, desperate to record what I had witnessed, but the words fled my mind. I was trapped in a moment between worlds, caught in the vault's relentless grasp. The candle sputtered and died, plunging me into darkness. The voices faded into a low hum, but the sense of being watched never left. The sealed chamber had revealed a fragment of its terrible secret, and I was left trembling in its shadow. The darkness that swallowed the chamber felt suffocating, as if the absence of light had opened a door to some deeper, darker realm. My breathing was shallow and uneven, my chest tight with the residue of terror. The candle's extinguishing had left me alone with the obsidian box's silent malevolence, a presence so thick it pressed against my skin like an invisible shroud. I sank to the cold stone floor, wrapping my arms around my knees, trying to gather some semblance of calm. The whispering chorus that had invaded my mind still lingered, a haunting echo that refused to fade. It was not merely sound, it was a voice that clawed at the edges of sanity, a tangle of sorrow, rage, and desperate warning that refused to let me forget. The sealed chamber was more than a storage room. It was a sanctum of dread, a place where the Vatican had locked away not just relics but fragments of darkness, secrets so terrible that even the strongest faith might shatter under their weight. And I was now a keeper of these secrets, marked by the shadow that clung to the obsidian box and seeped into my soul. My mind reeled as I struggled to rationalize what I had witnessed. Was this some supernatural force? A manifestation of collective fear? Or something far older, something that defied all explanation? The walls around me seemed to breathe with hidden life, the faint glow of the runes still etched in my vision like scars burned into stone. I reached for my notebook, hands trembling as I tried to capture the moment's raw horror. Words felt inadequate, fragile against the vast, unknowable darkness I'd glimpsed. The vault had shifted beneath me, no longer just a place of history but a living entity, filled with voices that demanded to be heard, stories desperate to be told. Despite the fear clawing at my heart, a stubborn ember of determination flickered within me, the secrets the Vatican tries Ed to Barry were not simply artifacts of the past. They were warnings, echoes of battles fought in shadows, of faith tested against unimaginable darkness. To turn away now would be to abandon the truth. Slowly I rose to my feet, the chill lingering but tempered by resolve. The sealed chamber had left its mark on me, a reminder that some doors should remain closed, but that some truths must be faced, no matter the cost. As I stepped out of the chamber and back into the labyrinth of the vault, I felt the weight of the past and the future converging. The obsidian box's darkness followed me still, a shadow stitched into the fabric of my being, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the vault's secrets were far from finished with me. The chapel was a sanctuary of silence amid the vast labyrinth of the Vatican, a small space where light filtered softly through stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic colors onto ancient stone floors. Today it felt different, less a place of peace and more a threshold to something unseen. The heavy scent of old incense mingled with dust, settling thick in the air, wrapping around me like a veil. I arrived just as twilight slipped into dusk, the fading light turning the chapel's shadows long and fluid. The stillness was almost tangible, broken only by the faint rustle of my footsteps and the distant murmur of prayers echoing through the vast corridors. But beneath the surface calm, a subtle tension thrummed, a quiet hum of unease that I could neither ignore nor fully understand. This chapel was rarely part of my usual rounds, but a recent directive had brought me here, to inspect a collection of relics stored in a hidden niche behind the altar. The Vatican's records were sparse, hinting at objects too sensitive for the main vault, items wrapped in secrecy and silence. The thought of what might lie behind that conce, a lead door, sent a chill down my spine. I paused before the altar, the polished marble cool under my fingertips as I reached for the hidden latch. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow chamber filled with relics, fragments of bone, faded parchments, and delicate artifacts encased in glass. Each seemed suspended in time, cloaked in the quiet reverence of forgotten prayers. The air inside the niche was colder, heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang that prickled at the back of my throat. The relics felt different here, less like historical artifacts and more like vessels of something alive. I noticed faint symbols etched into the glass cases, arcane and worn, whispering of protection and warning. As I began my inspection, the chapel's colors dimmed further, shadows pooling in the corners, stretching like dark fingers reaching toward me. The silence deepened into something more, an expectant hush that pressed on my chest, making each breath feel labored. I tried to steady my nerves, reminding myself that these halls had seen centuries of faith, suffering, and devotion. But today, the chapel felt less like a refuge and more like a threshold, an entryway to secrets best left undisturbed. With the faintest shiver, I reached for my notebook. The task was clear: document everything, no matter how unsettling, no matter how much the silence seemed to watch and wait. The whispers in the chapel had begun, and I was listening. As I stood in the cramped niche behind the altar, the air grew colder still, so cold that it seeped through my clothes and settled into my bones. The faint metallic scent thickened, sharp and almost electric, prickling at the back of my throat. My flashlight's beam quivered as I swept it over the relics, their glass cases reflecting flickers of light like distant eyes watching me. The faint symbols etched on the glass seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat just beyond perception. I was bare. Halfway through my inspection when a subtle shift disturbed the stillness, a barely perceptible movement, a flicker in the corner of my eye. I froze, heart pounding so loudly it seemed to drown out the silence. I swung the light toward the source, but there was nothing there. Just shadows, deep and unyielding, clinging to the edges of the chamber. The whispers started then, soft at first like the rustling of old pages or the sigh of the wind through ancient stone. They grew louder, weaving around me in a delicate but insistent thread, curling and curling until they wrapped tight around my mind. The words were unintelligible, but their tone was clear, urgent, desperate, warning. My breath hitched as the temperature plummeted further. I rubbed my hands together, trying to stave off the chill, but the cold was no longer just physical. It was something else, something that clawed beneath my skin. A sudden flicker in the corner of the room caught my eye again. This time the shadow seemed to form into a shape, an outline of a figure draped in tattered robes, face hidden beneath a deep hood. The figure's presence was overwhelming, a quiet sorrow and menace that pressed down on me with crushing weight. I swallowed hard, gripping my notebook with trembling fingers, torn between fascination and a rising tide of dread. The figure didn't move closer but remained just beyond the light's reach, an unspoken guardian of the chapel's darkest secrets. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a tempest of broken prayers and lost souls. Suddenly, the candle flickering on the altar guttered, casting long, distorted shadows that danced wildly on the walls. The glass cases rattled softly, a sound like bones clacking together in the distance. My heart leapt as a cold breeze swept through the niche, carrying with it the faintest echo of a voice, fragile, pleading, and utterly hums.
Once.
The moment the candle sputtered and the glass cases quieted, the oppressive silence returned, but it was heavier now, laden with an invisible weight I could neither see nor shake. My breath caught in my throat as the cold lingered, seeping deep beneath my skin and into my bones, leaving a hollow ache that pulsed with every heartbeat. The whispers had faded into an echo, but their sorrowful urgency still clung to the air like a stubborn fog. I sank slowly to the cold stone floor, clutching my notebook to my chest, as if it could shield me from the unseen forces pressing in. The chapel's once comforting stillness had transformed into a prison of silence, where every shadow seemed alive with watching eyes, every flicker of light a trembling heartbeat in the dark. I felt both exposed and engulfed, caught in a moment suspended between dread and awe. My mind raced, replaying the fleeting vision of the hooded figure, the swirling whispers, and the sudden chill that had crashed over me. Rational explanations waged war against raw instinct. Was it fatigue, the vault's isolation playing tricks on my senses? Or was there something real, something ancient lurking beneath the chapel's holy facade, waiting to be acknowledged? I found myself questioning everything, my purpose here, the fragile line between faith and fear, the nature of the relics I was sworn to protect. The symbols etched on the glass cases no longer looked like mere decoration. They felt like seals, warnings carved in a language older than memory, meant to keep something contained or perhaps to protect the living from what lay within. The weight of the experience settled deep inside me, a knot of anxiety and wonder I couldn't untangle. I opened my notebook and wrote with trembling hands, desperate to capture not just the facts but the raw, trembling truth of what I had felt, yet words felt feeble, incapable of holding the darkness I had glimpsed. Slowly I rose to my feet, the chill still clinging but now tempered by a fragile resolve. I realized that my role had shifted, no longer a mere cataloger of relics but a witness to a hidden world where faith, fear, and forbidden knowledge intertwined. The whispers in the chapel were a call, a warning, and I could no longer turn away. As I left the niche, the stained glass filtered fading light onto the floor, the colors muted but still beautiful, a fragile reminder of hope amid shadow. The chapel's silence had deepened, but so had my understanding. The vault's secrets were alive, watching, waiting, and so was I. The forgotten library lay tucked away in the deepest recesses of the Vatican, a cavernous room hidden behind a false wall in one of the lesser-known corridors. Its existence was whispered about among a select few, a repository of banned texts and occult manuscripts deemed too dangerous or heretical for public eyes. I had heard stories from senior archivists, tales of books that breathed secrets and pages that seemed to shimmer with a light all their own. That day, as I approached the concealed entrance, the air was thick with dust and the scent of aged parchment. The soft scrape of my footsteps on the worn stone floor was the only sound accompanying me in the vast silence. The dim glow of my flashlight illuminated the intricate carvings on the false wall, runes and symbols etched with painstaking precision. I traced my fingers over the ancient marks, feeling a tremor of unease ripple through me. The panel shifted slightly under my touch, revealing a narrow stairway spiraling down into darkness. I hesitated for a moment, the chill creeping up my spine warning me of what might lie beneath. But duty called. I was here to document, to witness, and to catalog the Vatican's most forbidden relics and texts. With a steadying breath, I stepped down, the air growing colder, heavier with each step. At the bottom, the library opened into a vast chamber lined with towering shelves crammed with leather-bound tomes, scrolls, and manuscripts in languages both ancient and lost. The smell of mold and ink filled the air, an intoxicating yet oppressive perfume. Dust motes danced in the beams of light, floating like restless spirits. The silence here was different, thick and expectant, as if the library itself was holding its breath. I ran my fingers along the spines of books, each one humming with a silent power, a weight of knowledge that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Some of the titles were written in scripts I couldn't read, their covers adorned with strange symbols and sigils that made my skin crawl. I pulled out a particularly old volume, its leather cracked and pages yellowed with age. The text inside was handwritten in a script so fine and intricate it looked almost like a web. As I flipped through, a sudden draft swept through the room, despite the lack of any visible source of air. The candle I had lit flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and twist along the walls. I swallowed hard, reminding myself that fear was a dangerous illusion, a trick of the mind. But even as I told myself this, a whisper seemed to brush past my ear, a faint, fleeting sound like the rustle of pages turning on their own. The forgotten library was no ordinary place. It was alive with secrets and warnings, and I was stepping further into its depths. The whisper of pages turning was barely audible at first, a faint, delicate sound that seemed to float just beyond the edge of hearing. I paused, heart pounding, and swept my flashlight over the towering shelves, searching for the source. The library's silence was vast, broken only by that eerie rustling, like a book flipping open on its own, or unseen hands moving through the stacks. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Apesot. The candle's flame flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the cracked stone walls. The air thickened suddenly, growing dense and heavy, as though the library itself had drawn a breath and was now holding it. I felt watched, the sensation prickling at my skin, as though countless unseen eyes followed my every move. As I moved deeper into the labyrinth of shelves, the rustling grew louder, more insistent. I rounded a corner and caught sight of a book resting on a pedestal, a large ancient tome bound in dark leather, its cover embossed with symbols that seemed to writhe under my gaze. The pages fluttered, flipping on their own, as though an invisible reader was scanning its contents. My breath hitched. I wanted to back away, to leave this place and its unnatural activity behind, but something rooted me in place, a morbid curiosity, a sense that I was standing on the edge of a truth too vast to ignore. Slowly I reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the tome's cover. The moment my skin made contact, a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the floor and into my chest. The library seemed to shift, the shadows lengthened, stretching like fingers that sought to grasp and pull me into their depths. The rustling grew to a crescendo, a chorus of whispered voices rising around me, layered and overlapping, filled with warnings, sorrow, and fury. A sudden gust extinguished my candle, plunging the room into darkness broken only by the weak beam of my flashlight. I stumbled back, heart racing, as the voices swirled louder, a tempest of broken prayers and desperate pleas that filled my mind. My hands shook uncontrollably as I fumbled for my notebook, desperate to record what I was experiencing, but the words dissolved in the flood of emotions crashing over me. The tome's pages stopped flipping, settling on a passage I couldn't read but felt deep within my bones. The symbols seemed to glow faintly, pulsing with an ancient power that filled the room. I realized then that the forgotten library was not simply a place of books and knowledge. It was a vessel of memory, a repository of things better left buried. I forced myself to turn away, heart heavy and mind racing, but the library's whispers followed me like shadows clinging to my skin. The secrets I had uncovered were alive, restless, and they had chosen to speak. After the voices faded and the oppressive hum softened into silence, I found myself sitting on the cold stone floor of the forgotten library, my back pressed against a towering shelf filled with ancient tomes. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the weight of centuries had settled inside me, embedding itself deep into my bones. My hands still trembled, the adrenaline slowly draining but leaving behind a residue of unease that refused to lift. I traced the faded symbols etched into the leather of the tome I had touched, feeling the faintest pulse beneath my fingertips, as though the book still throbbed with a hidden life, a heartbeat trapped beneath layers of dust and forgotten spells. The room around me was still bathed in shadows, the flickering candlelight long extinguished, leaving only the dim glow of my flashlight to illuminate the vast expanse of knowledge and secrets surrounding me. The library had always been a place of mystery, but today it felt alive in a way that was both fascinating and terrifying. It wasn't just the books or relics. It was the memories and warnings woven into every corner, every page, every whisper. The voices I had heard were not merely echoes from the past. They were a living testament to the hidden battles between faith and darkness that had raged through these halls for centuries. My mind raced with questions I dared not fully confront. What exactly had I disturbed? Was the knowledge within these tomes a gift or a curse? Had I inadvertently opened a door that should have remained sealed? The answers eluded me, tangled in a web of ancient fears and forbidden truths that felt beyond human comprehension. I tried to focus on the task, recording what I had experienced, documenting the relics and texts, but the words felt inadequate, too fragile to hold the enormity of the unknown I had glimpsed. The fear that gripped me was not one of physical danger alone, but something more profound, the realization that some secrets carry a cost far greater than I had ever imagined. Sitting there in the silence, I confronted a growing sense of isolation. The vault, the basilica, the library, all these sacred spaces were entwined in a delicate balance, a fragile barrier between the light of faith and the shadows lurking just beyond. I was no longer simply a custodian, I was a witness to this eternal struggle, a reluctant participant in a story that stretched far beyond my understanding. Slowly, I rose to my feet, the chill still clinging to my skin, but now tempered by a hard-earned resolve. I would continue this journey no matter how dark or uncertain it became. The forgotten library had shown me a glimpse of the depths beneath the surface, depths filled with whispers, shadows, and truths that refused to stay hidden. And as I stepped away from the shelves, I carried those whispers with me, their weight a constant reminder that some secrets are never truly forgotten. The silent crypt lay beneath the Vatican like a shadow within shadows, a place few dared to speak of, let alone visit. It was said to be a resting ground for forgotten souls, a tomb sealed away from light and time. I arrived there on a cold, overcast evening, the air outside thick with the scent of damp stone and ancient earth. A fine mist clung to the narrow stairwell that led downward, curling around me like ghostly fingers as I descended. The entrance was heavy, carved from solid marble, its surface etched with symbols worn by centuries of neglect. As I pushed the door open, a shudder passed through me, a premonition that this was not merely a burial chamber but something far more unsettling. The chill inside was immediate and absolute, a biting cold that seeped through the fabric of my clothes and settled deep into my bones. I switched on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, revealing rows of stone coffins and alcoves carved directly into the crypt walls. The silence was profound, so complete that it felt as if the air itself had been drained of sound. Every footstep echoed, a lonely percussion in the vast emptiness. The crypt's air was thick with the scent of decay and dust, mingled with something faintly metallic, like dried blood. It was a scent that triggered an uneasy feeling deep within me, a sense that the dead were not entirely at rest. My breath came out in visible puffs, misting in the cold air as I moved carefully, my fingers tracing the cold stone surfaces, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down. I noticed strange markings on some of the tombs, symbols I recognized from my studies, but here they took on a sinister aspect. They were protective sigils, but also warnings, etched in haste and desperation. It was clear that the crypt was more than a resting place. It was a sealed prison, a barrier against whatever lay beneath. The atmosphere grew heavier with every step, a tangible presence that seemed to watch me from the shadows. The crypt wasn't just silent, it was waiting for something, or someone. As I documented the relics and inscriptions, a faint sound caught my attention, the slow, rhythmic tapping of what I thought was water dripping somewhere deep within the stone. But the rhythm was deliberate, too precise for nature. It echoed around the chamber, a metronome counting down to something unseen. I paused, heart hammering, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. The silent crypt was alive with secrets that whispered from the past, warnings carved in stone waiting for me to listen. The rhythmic tapping grew louder, echoing off the ancient stone walls like a heartbeat pulsing in the darkness. It wasn't random. The pattern was too deliberate, too precise, as though some unseen presence was marking time, counting down to an inevitable moment. I froze, breath caught in my throat, flashlight trembling in my grasp as the shadows stretched and twisted around me. The cold here was no longer just physical. It carried with it a suffocating weight, pressing down on my chest like a vice. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to flee from whatever was lurking in the silent crypt, but my curiosity, stubborn and reckless, held me rooted in place. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with expectation, a tension that vibrated through the air and settled inside my bones. Then, without warning, the floor beneath me seemed to shift, a faint tremor that rippled through the stone, unsettling dust motes in the stale air. I stumbled back, heart pounding, as a faint glow began to emanate from the cracks between the coffins. The protective sigils I'd seen earlier flickered faintly, pulsing with an eerie light, as if the crypt itself was coming alive. The tapping turned into a whispering chant, layered and indistinct, threading through the stillness like a cold wind. The words were ancient, incomprehensible, but their tone was clear, a warning, a plea, and something far darker lurking beneath the surface. I could feel the presence drawing closer, a cold breath on my neck, a whisper in my ear that made my skin crawl. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, searching for the source of the voice. The stone coffins seemed to pulse with life, their cold surfaces glistening as if wet with unseen moisture. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of decay and iron, and the tapping grew faster, an urgent, insistent beat that matched the frantic pounding of my heart. A sudden chill swept through the crypt and a shadow flickered at the edge of my vision. An indistinct shape, tall and cloaked in darkness, its features obscured but its presence undeniable. My breath caught, and I stumbled backward, tripping over a loose stone. The whispers rose into a crescendo, filling my mind with fragmented images, faces twisted in agony, prayers unanswered, a darkness that consumed all light. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, desperate to escape the crypt's growing malevolence. But as I turned to run, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, plunging me into complete darkness. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed in from all sides. In that moment, I understood. The silent crypt was no ordinary tomb. It was a prison, and I had awakened something that was not ready to be freed. The darkness swallowed me whole, an oppressive void that seemed to press in from every side, thick and suffocating. My heart thundered in my chest, the only sound in the vast silence of the silent crypt. For a moment I was completely alone, or so I told myself, but the weight of unseen eyes bore down, a presence lingering just beyond perception, watching, waiting. I sank to the cold stone floor, trembling uncontrollably. The echo of the slammed door still reverberated in my mind, a sharp punctuation to the terrifying crescendo I had just endured. The tapping had ceased, but its rhythm seemed to pulse in my veins, a reminder that the crypt's secrets were far from silent now. I could still hear the whispers, faint, distant, yet impossibly persistent, threads of sorrow and warning that tangled with my thoughts. Trying to steady my breath, I forced myself to listen, the sigh. Lentz was not empty. It was charged, pregnant with meaning I could not yet grasp. The crypt was a threshold, a boundary between worlds, and in disturbing it, I had stepped beyond the veil. I was no longer a mere observer. I had become part of the story, a participant in a tale far older and darker than I had imagined. Fear mingled with fascination as I sat there, cold seeping into my bones, my mind racing to make sense of what had happened. What was this place truly? A tomb, a prison, or a warning carved into stone meant to protect the living from the darkness it contained? The protective sigils on the coffins took on new meaning now, barriers holding back something ancient and malevolent, something that resented my presence. I felt a profound loneliness then, an isolation deeper than any physical solitude. The crypt's silence was a living thing, a sentinel guarding secrets too terrible to be told, and I was left with the knowledge that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. As I finally forced myself to rise, the air seemed to shift subtly, less oppressive, but no less charged. The faint scent of iron lingered, a reminder of the blood and sacrifice woven into the crypt's history. I knew the vault's secrets were not just relics to be catalogued, but warnings etched in stone and shadow. Walking back through the winding corridors, the crypt's darkness followed me, a shadow stitched into my soul. The experience had left its mark, a lingering thread of dread and curiosity entwined in my thoughts. I was haunted, not just by what I had seen, but by what I had yet to understand. The silent crypt was not silent anymore, and neither was I. The portrait hung in a small, rarely visited antechamber of the Vatican, a dimly lit room lined with dusty tapestries and faded frescoes. It was said to be a likeness of a cardinal whose name had long been erased from the archives. A figure shrouded in rumor and shadow. I had been tasked with cataloging the room's contents, a routine assignment that should have been uneventful, but the moment I stepped inside, something felt off, an uneasy stillness that pressed against my senses like a weight. The air was stale, tinged with the faint scent of oil paint and aged wood. My footsteps echoed softly against the stone floor, the only sound in the quiet chamber. The portrait's eyes caught my attention immediately, dark, intense, and unsettlingly lifelike. It was as if they followed me, watching my every move with a gaze that was both accusing and mournful. I circled the room slowly, my flashlight beam flickering over cracked frames and ancient relics gathered in shadowed corners. The fading light from a nearby window cast long, angular shadows that twisted across the walls like fingers reaching out. Despite the quiet, the chamber felt charged with an unspoken presence, a silent tension that prickled the hairs on the back of my neck. The cardinal's portrait was mounted above a carved wooden chest, its surface etched with cryptic symbols that I couldn't immediately decipher. The chest's lock was rusted but intact, its secrets sealed tight for reasons unknown. I ran my fingers lightly over the symbols, a shiver running down my spine as the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, sharp and unexpected. The faintest sound, a soft whisper, brushed against my ear, barely audible but impossible to ignore. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty save for dust motes drifting lazily in the pale light. I told myself it was just the wind, a trick of the silence playing on my nerves. Yet the portrait's gaze seemed to darken, its eyes shimmering with a flicker of something alive. I felt an overwhelming urge to look away, but found myself unable to break the connection. It was a gaze that held centuries of secrets, pain, betrayal, and something far darker lurking beneath the surface. I took out my notebook, determined to focus on the task, but my hand trembled slightly as I began to write. The chamber was no ordinary storage room. It was a threshold to forgotten memories, a place where the past refused to stay buried. And as I catalogued the relics, I sensed that the portrait's gaze was not just watching me, it was waiting. As I stood before the portrait, the uneasy stillness in the chamber deepened into something far more tangible, an invisible pressure that seemed to squeeze the air from my lungs. The faint whisper I'd heard earlier returned, this time clearer but still unintelligible, like a voice half-remembered from a dream. It brushed around me, slipping beneath my skin, stirring a coldness that crawled along my spine. The room felt smaller, the shadows stretching and thickening, pooling around the edges of the walls like dark ink spreading on parchment. The flickering beam of my flashlight danced nervously over the carved chest beneath the portrait, casting shifting patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the shadows themselves were trying to communicate. My heartbeat quickened, loud in my ears, a steady drum that underscored the mounting dread. Then, without warning, the painted eyes of the cardinal seemed to shift, the pupils dilating ever so slightly. The gaze that had once been still and mournful took on a sharper, colder edge, watchful and piercing. I blinked hard, questioning my senses, but when I opened my eyes again, the change was unmistakable. The portrait was alive in some unfathomable way. A sudden draft stirred the room, carrying with it a faint metallic scent, like blood long dried but never forgotten. The rusted lock on the wooden chest creaked as if moved by an unseen hand. The soft whisper swelled into a murmured chant, unintelligible but urgent, pressing against my mind with a weight that made my thoughts scatter like dry leaves in a storm. I took a hesitant step back, but the air thickened, making every breath a labor. The shadows writhed closer, curling around my ankles and crawling up my legs like icy fingers. The temperature plummeted, and a sense of suffocating despair settled over me, a feeling that the chamber itself was mourning some ancient betrayal. My hands trembled violently as I reached out toward the chest, compelled by a force I didn't understand, part fear, part fascination. The chant rose, becoming a cacophony of broken prayers and curses, filling the room with a spectral symphony. I pressed my palm against the cold wood, and the surface beneath my skin seemed to pulse with a faint heartbeat, slow but steady. For a brief moment, the whispering ceased, replaced by a chilling silence so profound it roared in my ears. Then a sudden, sharp snap echoed through the chamber. The lock broke free, falling to the floor with a clatter that shattered the quiet. I stared at the chest, heart hammering, the weight of unseen eyes heavy on my back. The portrait's gaze bore into me, unblinking and eternal, as if it were waiting for what I would do next. And in that moment I understood. Some secrets were not meant to be uncovered, and some eyes never truly close. The sound of the lock falling echoed long after it hit the cold stone floor, a harsh metallic punctuation that seemed to resonate with something buried deep within me. The portrait's gaze never wavered. Those dark eyes held an accusation and a sorrow that felt almost personal. I stood frozen, breath shallow, heart hammering as the weight of what I had just triggered settled heavy on my shoulders. The room's temperature remained stubbornly low, the chill seeping through my clothes and into my bones. I rubbed my arms in a futile attempt to chase away the cold, but it wasn't just the physical cold that disturbed me, it was something far deeper. A quiet, relentless unease that clawed at the edges of my mind, whispering warnings I couldn't fully understand yet felt impossible to ignore. I crouched beside the chest, hands trembling, staring at the broken lock. Part of me wanted to retreat, to leave whatever secrets lay hidden inside undisturbed. But another part, the part that had drawn me to this job in the first place, urged me forward, a morbid curiosity mixed with a sense of responsibility. I couldn't turn away, not now. As I carefully lifted the heavy lid, the scent of aged wood and something faintly metallic, like rust and dried blood, rose up in a wave. Inside, layers of velvet cradled a small collection of objects, a tarnished crucifix, a faded parchment, and a delicate, cracked medallion bearing the same cryptic symbols etched on the chest. Each item seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, a silent testament to the past secrets. I traced my fingers over the medallion, the edges rough and worn, and a shiver ran down my spine. The portrait's gaze felt like it followed my every move, a silent witness to the unearthing of forbidden history. The unease in my chest grew heavier, a mix of reverence, fear, and something else I couldn't name, a profound sense of crossing a boundary. I closed the chest slowly, the broken lock lying useless beside it, and stood up, the weight of the room pressing down like a shroud. The whispers, once distant, now seemed to echo faintly in the silence, reminders that the past was never truly gone, only waiting to be remembered. As I left the chamber, I cast one last glance at the portrait. Its eyes seemed softer now, as if mourning the awakening of secrets long buried. I knew I had opened a door that could never be closed again, and the burden of that knowledge settled deep within me. The portrait's gaze was no longer just a painting, it was a sentinel, a guardian of truths too aroused to forget, and I was left with the weight of those truths, carried silently in the shadows. The echoing hall was a vast chamber deep within the Vatican's catacombs, a place whispered about in hushed tones among the archivists but rarely visited. It was said to be a corridor where even footsteps seemed to vanish into oblivion, swallowed by the heavy silence that draped the stone walls. I found myself standing at its entrance on a dreary afternoon, the air damp and cold, the fading light from the outside world barely filtering through the narrow vents above. As I stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The air grew heavier, thick with a silence so profound it pressed against my ears and clogged my thoughts. Every breath I took was sharp and shallow, the chill settling deep in my lungs. The stone beneath my boots was worn smooth by centuries of unseen passage, yet there was no other soul to be found. I switched on my flashlight, the beam carving a narrow path through the gloom. The hall stretched endlessly, walls adorned with faded frescoes and symbols nearly erased by time. Shadows pooled in every corner, deep and impenetrable, as if the darkness itself was alive and watching. The echoes the hall was named for were absent. Instead, my footsteps vanished into nothingness, swallowed whole by the emptiness. I moved slowly, my senses heightened, every sound amplified by the oppressive quiet. The scent of damp stone mixed with faint traces of incense lingered in the air, a ghost of rituals long forgotten. The silence felt less like peace and more like a barrier, a threshold guarding something beyond comprehension. I paused before an arched doorway leading to a side chamber, the faintest hint of movement flickering at the edge of my vision. A whisper, barely audible, brushed past my ear, a breath of sound that was almost a plea. I spun around, flashlight sweeping the shadows, but there was nothing, just the stillness and the darkness pressing close. E-Hall was a paradox, both empty and full, silent yet alive with unspoken secrets. My heart beat unevenly, a steady drum of anticipation and dread. I knew that every step I took was a step deeper into a place where time seemed to fold in on itself, where the past lingered stubbornly like a shadow refusing to fade. I took out my notebook, hands steady but heart racing, determined to record every detail. The echoing hall was more than just stone and shadow. It was a living memory, a vessel for the voices and histories that the Vatican had tried to bury, and I was about to listen. As I ventured deeper into the echoing hall, the silence that had seemed so complete began to shift. It was subtle at first, a barely perceptible vibration in the air, like the distant hum of a tuning fork just beyond hearing. I paused, heart pounding, and listened closely. The emptiness around me felt suddenly charged, electric with something unseen. The shadows along the walls seemed to ripple and undulate, as though stirred by a breath of air I could not feel. My flashlight flickered unexpectedly, the beam wavering and casting jagged patterns that danced unnaturally on the ancient stone. A faint scent of burnt incense wafted through the cold air, sharp and acrid, mingling with the ever-present dampness of the catacombs. Then came the sound, the first faint echo of footsteps that were not mine. They were soft and tentative, yet unmistakably human, pacing slow and deliberate, measured as if counting time. I stopped dead, every nerve screaming, flashlight trembling in my grip. The steps circled behind me, growing nearer, then paused, leaving only the echo of their presence hanging heavy in the stillness. I spun around, beam slicing through the gloom, but saw nothing. No figure, no shadow, just the cold, unyielding stone walls staring back. The footsteps resumed, now moving toward the far end of the hall, fading into silence once more. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered, a suffocating presence that clung to my skin and settled in my chest. My breath hitched as I noticed a faint whispering, indistinct and fragmented, curling around me like smoke. The voices were layered, disjointed fragments of prayers, lamentations, and warnings, weaving a tapestry of despair and urgency. The air grew colder, a biting chill that seeped through my clothes and numbed my fingers. Suddenly the floor beneath me trembled lightly, a subtle vibration that felt like a heartbeat syncing with my own. The ancient frescoes on the walls seemed to shift in the dim light, faces contorted in silent screams, eyes that followed me with accusing gazes. A sharp gust swept through the hall, extinguishing my flashlight, plunging me into pitch darkness. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain still, listening. The footsteps had ceased, replaced by the softest echo of a breath. Close, too close. I could feel it against my neck, a cold presence that whispered my name, barely audible but unmistakable. The voices swelled briefly, then fell silent, leaving a void filled only by my rapid heartbeat. In the suffocating darkness, I realized the echoing hall was no empty corridor. It was alive with memories, restless spirits trapped between worlds, and I had unknowingly become their witness. The darkness lingered long after my flashlight flickered back to life, the weak beam barely piercing the thick shadows of the echoing hall. My breath came in shallow gasps, the cold air biting at my lungs and chilling me to the core. I sank slowly to the cold stone floor, the weight of what I had just experienced pressing heavily on my chest. I tried to steady my racing heart, but the memories of those footsteps, soft, deliberate, and unseen, haunted me relentlessly. The echo of the voices, layered with prayers and warnings, lingered like a ghostly refrain in the corners of my mind. It was as if the hall itself carried the sorrow and desperation of countless souls trapped in limbo, their stories locked away in the cold stone walls. A profound loneliness settled over me, deeper than any physical isolation. I was surrounded by silence, yet filled with the echoes of unseen lives, their pain palpable and raw. It was a solitude not of absence, but of presence, the presence of history, memory, and loss pressing in around me like a shroud. I ran my hands over the worn frescoes, the faces frozen in silent torment, their eyes seeming to plead for remembrance or release. The thought struck me hard. These were not just walls, but witnesses to suffering and secrets too terrible to fully comprehend. The hall was a living archive of anguish, a place where the past refused to rest. As I gathered my notes, the chill in the air seemed to seep deeper, a reminder that some places are never truly empty, and some stories never fully told. I wrestled with the weight of the experience, the line between curiosity and fear blurring. What had I disturbed? What restless shadows now clung to my footsteps? Slowly I rose, the cold stone biting into my knees as I stood. The hall's silence pressed in once more, but this time it felt different, less a void, more a heavy watchfulness. The echoing hall had spoken, and I had listened. But in doing so, I had become part of its story. Walking back toward the entrance, I felt the lingering presence trail me like a shadow stitched to my skin. I knew the echoes would follow me beyond these walls, haunting my dreams and waking thoughts alike. The experience left me changed, marked by a truth I could neither ignore nor fully understand. The Vatican's secrets were vast and many, and I was but a small custodian in their endless unfolding. The echoing hall had shown me a fragment of its sorrow, and I would carry that weight silently, a burden and a warning for as long as I lived. The final seal was said to be the last barrier, the ultimate safeguard against something ancient and terrible buried deep beneath the Vatican. I first heard whispers of it during my early days cataloging the relics, a tale told in quiet, almost reverent tones by those who dared to speak at all. Now, standing before its heavy, iron-bound door, I felt the full weight of that story pressing down on me. The corridor leading to the seal was narrow and suffocating, walls close enough to brush my shoulders as I moved slowly forward. The air was thick with dust and an almost electric stillness, as though the very atmosphere held its breath. I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, the faintest tremor of unease that hinted at things best left undisturbed. The door itself was massive, ancient iron bands crisscrossing warped, weathered wood, secured by an intricate lock adorned with symbols I'd seen before in the darkest corners of the archives. These marks weren't just decorative, they were protective sigils, warnings, and curses all intertwined. The seal was a threshold, a line drawn between the world of light and the shadows lurking beyond. I reached out hesitantly, fingers brushing the cold metal. A sudden shiver coursed through me, as if the door exhaled a breath that chilled the air. The stone floor beneath my feet felt alive, humming faintly with a vibration that thrummed in sync with my heartbeat. It was a sensation both alien and terrifying. A reminder that the seal was more than just wood and iron. It was a living barrier, a sentinel against something vast and unseen. The corridor stretched behind me, silent and empty, but I felt eyes watching from the darkness. The weight of centuries bore down, heavy with the memory of sacrifices made to keep what lay beyond, locked away. I thought of the countless souls who had stood here before me, sworn to protect secrets that would unravel the very fabric of faith and reason. The cold seeped through my clothes, settling into my bones. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath and clear the swirl of thoughts crowding my mind. My role had always been to document and protect, never to question the cost. But standing here now, before the final seal, I understood that some secrets demanded a price paid in silence, fear, and sacrifice. I glanced down at the symbols once more, the intricate carvings pulsing faintly in the dim light. The seal wasn't just a door, it was a promise, a warning etched in stone and steel. Whatever waited beyond, it was not meant to see the light of day. The moment my hand touched the iron-bound door, a sudden, sharp vibration jolted through my fingers like the door itself was alive and recoiling at my presence. The chill that seeped into my skin was unlike any cold I'd ever felt. Deep, ancient, and biting straight to my core. It wasn't just metal or wood. It was a threshold between worlds, a barrier holding back something desperate to break free. As I stood frozen, the faint sound of a low hum began to fill the corridor, soft at first, almost imperceptible, but gradually rising in volume, resonating through the stone walls like the slow beating of a monstrous heart. The air thickened, heavy and electric, making each breath a labor. My skin prickled with the sensation of unseen eyes burning into me from the shadows. Then the symbols etched into the door seemed to glow faintly, a sickly greenish light pulsing in time with the humming. The protective sigils weren't just passive carvings. They felt alive, reacting to my presence with a warning I could neither ignore nor understand. A voice whispered in my mind, fragmented and indistinct, words that twisted and turned like a half-remembered prayer slipping through the cracks of consciousness. I tried to pull my hand away, but it was as if an unseen force held me fast, binding me to the seal. Panic surged, but my body refused to obey. The humming grew louder, a crescendo of sound that reverberated through the very stone beneath my feet. The temperature plunged, frost creeping along the edges of the door and curling into the cracks like spectral fingers. Suddenly the ground trembled beneath me, a low, rumbling quake that shook the corridor and sent dust cascading from the ceiling. The oppressive silence shattered as a chorus of whispers swelled around me, overlapping voices pleading, warning, cursing. Their tone was urgent, desperate, an echo of sacrifices made long ago to keep whatever lay beyond locked away. I felt a presence emerge from the darkness behind the seal, a weight, a force pressing against reality, eager to spill forth. It was invisible but palpable, a suffocating dread that clawed at my sanity. My vision blurred, and for a moment I glimpsed something beyond the door, a shifting mass of shadow and light, alive with hunger and ancient rage. With a sudden, violent jerk, the invisible grip released me. I stumbled back, gasping, the seal's glow fading into darkness once more. The humming ceased, replaced by an eerie stillness that pressed in like a shroud. My heart pounded wildly, and sweat beaded on my brow despite the cold. I knew then that the final seal was not just a barrier, but a warning. It held back a force too terrible to confront, a darkness that had almost broken free. And by touching it, I had awoken something that should have remained forever buried. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick and absolute, like the world itself was holding its breath. My chest heaved with ragged breaths, the cold from the corridor still clinging to my skin, but it was the weight in my mind that pressed hardest. The final seal wasn't just a door, it was a guardian, a sentinel, and a warning etched in iron and ancient magic. I sank slowly to the floor, the stone cold and unforgiving beneath me. My hands trembled uncontrollably, and every nerve felt raw, as if the boundary I had crossed had left invisible scars on my soul. The whispers I'd heard, the fragmented prayers, the desperate curses, they echoed faintly in my mind, haunting me long after the corridor had fallen silent. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just my imagination, stress, fatigue, the eerie isolation. But deep down, I knew that explanation wasn't enough. The chill that had seeped into my bones wasn't natural. The voices that whispered were more than memories. They were warnings, and the presence I'd felt was real. Something ancient, restless, and furious. The realization settled over me with a cold finality. I had disturbed a balance maintained for centuries. I had touched the boundary between worlds, and something had reached back. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. I was no longer just a custodian of relics. I was a witness to a darkness that could consume everything if unleashed. As I sat there, the flickering light from my dying flashlight casting long shadows on the walls, I felt a profound loneliness. The burden of the secret was mine alone to bear. The Vatican's sacred walls had held countless mysteries, but few as terrifying as what lay beyond the final seal. I understood now why it was so heavily guarded, and why few dared to approach it. Slowly I stood, muscles aching, and forced myself to leave the corridor. The echoes of the seal's hum seemed to follow me, a haunting reminder that the darkness was still there, waiting, Every step away was heavy with dread, the silence broken only by my own uneven breathing. Outside, the world felt distant, muted, as if I had crossed into a place where normal rules no longer applied. The experience changed something inside me. I wasn't just cataloging history anymore. I was entangled in it, bound by the secrets I had uncovered. The final seal had spoken in whispers and tremors, and I had listened, but some voices don't want to be heard, and some doors should never be touched.